وأصحابه أجمعين وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. أما بعد, continuing where we left off last Sunday. Last Sunday we were discussing the wudu of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And we also mentioned the 6 bare minimums of a valid wudu. For a person's wudu to be valid, they have to wash their face, including the mouth and nose, the arms, the hands and forearms, including the elbows, wipe over the head in its entirety, including the ears, front and back, and wash the feet, including the toes and ankles. These 4 things, and that these 4 things be done in that order, and that these 4 things be done in that order in succession of one another, meaning no huge gaps or spaces of time between them. It'll all be done together. This is the bare minimum of wudu. We also mentioned the description of the Prophet's wudu, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the most vivid of those and detailed of those descriptions is the one relied upon by Imam al-Bukhari and Muslim, which is the narration of Uthman ibn Affan, radiyallahu ta'ala anhu, where he teaches in great detail the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's wudu. But there are many companions who related his wudu and described it in great detail, as we would expect, because this is something that is common. And usually he would make wudu for each prayer, even if he already had wudu. We also discussed the things that break a person's wudu. We mentioned anything that comes out of the private parts, front or back. We mentioned deep sleep or unconsciousness. Deep sleep or unconsciousness. When we say deep sleep, we're talking about deep enough to where if you were to have broken your wudu, you would not notice, you would not be aware of it. This sleep is deep enough for a person's wudu to be most likely broken. Therefore, we make wudu. Likewise is the case for unconsciousness or intoxication or any of the things which make a person unaware of what might break his wudu. Another thing that we mentioned of that which will break a person's wudu is that a person's Islam become invalidated by something. The scholars of fiqh mentioned this. There are other things that are mentioned to be that are a difference of opinion amongst the scholarship of Islam, whether these things break a person's wudu or not. So for instance, if a person were to touch his own private parts, would this break a person's wudu? There are narrations, the narration of Busra and the narration of Talq ibn Adi. These 2 narrations, in one of them, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was asked, or he said, "Man massa dhakarahu falyatawadda." وفي رواية من مس ذكره دون ما حائل فليتوضأ. Whoever touches his private parts, meaning specifically his genitals, then he is to make wudu. Yet in the next narration, a man asked the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, if a man accidentally or if a man touches intentionally his genitals without any barrier, no clothing between them, will this break a person's wudu? The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam then asked rhetorically, وَهَلْ هُوَ إِلَّا بَضْعَةٌ مِنْكَ? Is your genitals but a part of your body? Meaning, no, it would not break your wudu. Just like if I were to say, if I touched my arm, would it break my wudu? It's a part of my body. Why would it break my wudu? These two narrations are authentic narrations. Some scholars mention that one of them is more authentic than the other. Then they differ on which of those two is more authentic. Some of them mention that one of them is authentic whilst the other is inauthentic. However, even if we were to say both narrations are authentic, if you touch your genitals, in one narration he tells us to make wudu, and in another he tells us, why would that break your wudu, rhetorically? Some scholars say, well, if you touch your genitals with desire, with sexual desire, that this would break your wudu. Why? Because the only time a person's genitals are considered to be different and unique from the rest of his body parts is because of sexual desire. This is the thought process. Whilst others mention that if we were to harmonize these two narrations, one narration articulates that it is preferred that a person repeat his wudu if he touches his genitals, whilst the other negates that it is obligatory, right? And this is the opinion of Shaykh al-Islam, rahimahullah, in Majmu' al-Fatawa, also Ibn al-Qayyim, and many others of the scholarship of Islam, including Imam Abu Hanifa, rahimahullah ta'ala, that it is something that is mustahab. It's something that is preferred. If you happen to touch your genitals with desire or without desire, whatever the case may be, that you repeat your wudu. This is fine. But it is not obligatory. What about if a person vomits? We have here a narration in a sunan that the Prophet ﷺ once vomited and then made wudu. Now, this introduces us to a very interesting question. The Prophet's actions alone, do they articulate that something is obligatory? Meaning, if he just does something, he doesn't say do it, he does it himself. Does it mean it's obligatory? The answer is no. And at face value, for him to merely do something doesn't make it obligatory. For him to command something, yes. But for him to do it doesn't make it obligatory. So vomiting does not break a person's wudu. It is preferred that you make wudu after that. Likewise, bleeding, excessive bleeding. Some scholars mention that what will break a person's wudu is al-kathir al-khabith al-kharij min al-badan al-fahish. That something come out of the body, whether it be pus or blood or something, vomit, right? Come out in excess from the body, that this will break a person's wudu. And there is no authentic narration that is completely clear that anything will break your wudu except for the things that we have mentioned here, right? It is preferred that a person make wudu. At best, there's no clear, authentic narration as such. And here's the question. In the companions' time, when they're going to war, how relevant is it that the Prophet clearly tell them, if you have a wound that is gushing blood, you need to make wudu? You would expect to find dozens of narrations like that, wouldn't you? At least in war, right? Because during battle, they're still making salah. So you would expect to find many narrations in many different situations where he said that. Yet we don't have any clear narration of that. So at best, that is an issue of istihbab. Another is if a person eats camel meat. Have we heard this one before? In one narration, the Prophet ﷺ was asked, should I make wudu after eating the meat of goats or sheep? He said, in shi'ta, if you want to. And then he said, the companion said, should I make wudu after eating the meat of camels? He said, no. He said, yes. Make wudu from eating camel meat. How common was it to eat camel meat in the Prophet's time? Incredibly common, right? Not only that, but when we look at the companions, radiyallahu anhum, all four of the khulafa, Abu Bakr and Umar and Uthman and Ali, viewed that to be abrogated, mansukh, that ruling to be mansukh, that it was a ruling before, just like eating, just like making wudu from food that fire has touched directly. This used to be a ruling in Islam, that if you eat something that is barbecued or something that the fire touches directly, you have to make wudu. But this was abrogated. And likewise is the issue with camel meat, and that's the opinion of the majority of the scholarship of Islam. The three madhahib, the madhab of Abu Hanifa and Malik and Al-Shafi'i, rahimahumullahu ta'ala. So I think we covered most of them. There's one more, and that comes up commonly, touching the skin of the opposite gender. Does this break a person's wudu? The answer is, it will only break a person's wudu if something comes out of the private parts because of it, as a result of it. But it in itself does not break a person's wudu. And this all roots back to the understanding of a verse in the Quran, أَوْ لَامَسْتُمُ النِّسَاءَ. So the scholars differed. لَامَسْتُمُ النِّسَاءَ. Does this mean intercourse? Or does this mean merely touching? Or does this mean touching with desire? And the answer is, touching here in the Arabic language is used in this context as a less vulgar way of saying intercourse. What's meant is intercourse, that will break a person's wudu, obviously. But merely touching someone of the opposite gender will not break a person's wudu. In a narration in As-Sunan, Aisha radiyallahu anha narrates that the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam would make wudu and prepare himself for salah, and then as he would leave, he may interact with her, or they may share a kiss, and he would not make his wudu over. He would go out and lead salah. So this is an acceptable narration. Wallahu ta'ala a'lam. This is all I can think of with regards to wudu. We had a question that came in during the week. If a person has a cut on his body, had a drop or spreading bleeding, wudu will become invalid. Is there any such valid opinion out there? We just mentioned that with regards to bleeding breaking a person's wudu. And the correct opinion is that it does not break a person's wudu. And the correct opinion, it doesn't even break a person's fasting. But we will get to those, inshallah, as we get closer to Ramadan, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala.
What if you're in the hospital bed?
Yeah, we will talk about tayammum in a moment, inshallah. I just want to make sure everybody is clear on the wudu. No other questions regarding wudu. Oftentimes people are very confused about, if I touch something that is filthy, will it break my wudu? Right? Like if a person touches, let's say, a dog or a pig somehow, or something that is filthy in itself, will it break a person's wudu? The answer is, wudu is broken by things that leave the body, not by the body coming in contact with other things. Nothing that you touch will break your wudu, except in some opinions, the genitals, and we discussed that. Now, yes?
One question, if somebody has excessive urination problem or excessive passing gas problem,
Right.
they do wudu, but within a minute it gets broken again.
Yeah.
So they do another wudu,
Mhm.
So how many times they have to do wudu if this will continue?
Wudu, this is an issue that falls into the category of da'im al-hadath. Da'im al-hadath means somebody is constantly breaking their wudu because of some medical condition or some exemption. And the answer is, a person makes his wudu one time per prayer session. And what breaks the person's wudu is the next prayer time starting. Okay? So let's say a person has this issue, they make wudu for dhuhr. They can pray for 2 hours if they want, no matter what happens after that first wudu. But what will break their wudu is if they stop praying for a time and then come back to pray, they need to make their wudu again. Or if the adhan of Asr is called. Once the time of Asr comes in, now they need to make wudu again. So the ruling for a person who is in constant hadath, a constant state of impurity, is that they make wudu one time per prayer session. And the only thing that will break their wudu is the next prayer coming in, right? That is the answer to that question now. Yes?
Cutting nail and hair after wudu, basically.
Right, this is, I'm glad you asked that because many years ago, almost 20 years ago, I had a really bad case of waswas, which means that I was constantly making wudu and I was always afraid my wudu was broken. This was many years ago before I started studying and one guy, I asked him, he was a roommate, and I said, could I borrow your nail clippers? And he said, here's the nail clippers. He had waswas too, so we were sharing in each other's insanity. So he said, here's the nail clippers, but I think I heard somewhere that if you clip your nails, you have to make wudu again. I'm not sure, but maybe. And so of course this sent me on a whole thing, right? Because anytime I would chip a nail after that, or anytime of course this would come into my mind that I have to run and make wudu. There is nothing and no opinion in any of the madahib that clipping a person's nails or hair will break your wudu. This has to do with Hajj and Umrah, Ihram. This was somehow confused by people from Ihram of Hajj and Umrah and somehow found its way into the rulings of wudu in people's minds, not in the books of the scholars of Islam. Now,
One of the things you mentioned about camel meat, but even seafood
yes.
is in some of that you are required to do.
Yeah, you know, in some madhab, in a very old opinion in the Hanafi madhab, that was later largely abandoned by many of the later Ahnaf scholars of the Hanafi madhab, is that anything that is not in the form of a fish, like a traditional fish, so an octopus or a crab or a lobster or a shrimp or something like that, is impermissible to eat in general. And that it may interfere with a person's wudu, qiyasan ala luhum al-ibil. But, you know, these are all opinions that were largely based on conjecture and later abandoned by the majority of the scholarship of Islam. You know, as narrations became more widespread and more documented, we were able to refine our understanding of these things. Now, yes?
Changing cloth or doing wudu with bare minimum clothing and then put covering.
Changing clothes?
Yeah.
Changing clothes will not interfere with a person's wudu at all. Nothing that you touch, nothing that you take off, nothing that you put on, nothing that you eat, nothing that comes out of your body unless it is from those two private parts. This is what breaks a person's wudu. Now, yes, sir.
I have a question about making ropes and socks. I'm not sure if we discussed this before.
Yes, we are going to have an entire thing about this because this is like Pandora's box. Once I open that right now, we're going to be sitting here till midnight, right? So We will have, in a week or two, we will have an entire sitting dedicated just to wiping over footwear. Now, our brother had mentioned the issue of tayammum. You know, you'd be surprised how unaware people are of how to make something like tayammum. The reason is because of the modernity that we live in, the modern times. We have access to water. It's almost unimaginable for us. Even some of us who grew up in a very impoverished neighborhoods, like myself, we had to go to the well to get water, but I've been living in America for so long, and that this is a distant memory. It's almost unimaginable to not have access to water. So many of us don't know how to make tayammum. And usually people ask these questions when they get really sick or when they're in some kind of situation and they have to make tayammum, then it occurs to them. However, tayammum is very easy. A couple weeks ago, we spoke about ghusl. We talked about the bare minimum and the sunnah way of making ghusl. We spoke last week about wudu, the bare minimum and the best way to make wudu. The only thing left of our verse in Surah Al-Ma'idah is tayammum, which is short and sweet because it is very simple. Tayammum takes the place of anything that water purifies if a person has an allowance to make tayammum. Okay? When does a person have an allowance to make tayammum? They are allowed to make tayammum when they do not have access to water or are unable to use that water. This is when a person makes tayammum. They may have access, but they can't use it because of illness or whatever, danger, extreme cold, or a person doesn't have access to water. Then a person will make tayammum. Tayammum will take the place of ghusl. It will take the place of wudu. And the only thing that breaks tayammum is the next prayer time coming in. That is one opinion, but that is a weaker opinion because tayammum again takes the place of what? Wudu, right? And if I make wudu for dhuhr, does the adhan of asr break my wudu? The answer is no. It is not any different with tayammum. The only thing that breaks tayammum is finding water or accessing water or being able to use it. When that allowance for making tayammum is no longer there, that will break a person's tayammum. So how do we make tayammum? Allah tells us in Surah Al-Ma'idah and in Surah Al-Nisa, فَامْسَحُوا بِوُجُوهِكُمْ وَأَيْدِيكُمْ مِنْهِ. Wipe over your faces and your hands. And he gives us two descriptions of that which is to be used in wiping over our face and hands. So he says, فَتَيَمَّمُوا صَعِيدًا طَيِّبًا. Those are the two descriptions. So Allah tells us, if you are unable to access water, then you are to make tayammum. And that tayammum is to be from that which is sa'id and tayyib. Sa'id in the Arabic language is anything that settles on top of a surface. I'm telling you now what the meaning is in the Arabic language. Anything that settles on a surface. Imagine that with me. Anything that settles on a surface. If I were to leave this phone here for an extended period of time, or even this carpet, or even the wall, over time, what settles on these things? Dust, right? Even the dashboard in my car, even the compartments on an airliner above where you put your carry-on bags, or on a wall or on a rock, anything that settles on top of the ground or on top of a desk or on top of a bookshelf, this is called sa'id in the Arabic language. Now notice Allah does not tell us what the sa'id is. He doesn't say sand. He doesn't say dirt. He doesn't say dust. He doesn't say any of these things. He says sa'id. So he tells us that it's something that settles on a surface. So what we understand from that is that tayammum is performed by any of those things, whether it's dirt or sand or dust or any of those things. Sometimes you go to a hospital and you find a dish next to the person and they have some dirt in the dish, or they have a rock that they brought from outside, and this is for the person to make tayammum. That is unnecessary. There's plenty to make tayammum with in the hospital. The wall beside you is something that you can make tayammum from. The Prophet ﷺ made tayammum from a wall before. In an authentic narration, he made tayammum right off of a wall in Medina. And we see that the desert is made up of what? It's made up of sand, right? In some madhahib, it has to be dirt. It can't be sand. Imagine all of these companions traveling for months on end through the desert, and they know they're not going to be able to make wudu for those travels. They have to make tayammum because water reserves are very slim, and we have to use that for our animals and for ourselves, right? So the only thing around is sand. You would expect that they would have dirt with them that they would carry with them, right? That would have to happen, but we have no narrations ever of the companions carrying something from another environment in order to make tayammum, ever. The whole point of tayammum is that you use whatever environment is accessible to you. That's the point of tayammum. It is not that I need to bring dirt from somewhere else or bring a rock and carry it around with me, like Bani Israel carried their rock around with Musa for water, and now I make tayammum off of that. That defeats the purpose of the allowance of tayammum. Tayammum does not purify anything physically. It is a spiritual purification. It is a ceremonious thing. It's not supposed to have any physical effect that we are aware of. And so when a person cannot access water, or can access it but can't use it, then they make tayammum. The description of tayammum in the Quran, sa'id, tayyib. Sa'id, anything that settles on a surface that is not of that surface. And two, is that it is pure. So a person can't make tayammum off of a surface that has filth on it. Clear. Those are the only descriptions of what tayammum is. Now, we move on through the verse, and Allah says, فَامْسَحُوا بِوُجُوهِكُمْ وَأَيْدِيكُمْ مِنْهُ. Wipe your faces and your hands using that sa'id. So, there's a narration, which is in a Sahih, that Umar ibn al-Khattab was with another companion once, and they ran out of water. And they didn't know how to make tayammum. This is in the very early days, before this became common knowledge. And so this was their first experience needing to make tayammum. So the two companions, Umar ibn al-Khattab and another, they decided, let's make tayammum. He said, Umar narrates, he says, as for my companion, the other guy with him, he merely wiped over his hands and his face. He says, as for me, I rolled around in the dirt like an animal, right? What he meant by that is he was basically making wudu with the dirt. So when we got back to the Prophet ﷺ, I explained to him what happened. And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, look at how I do it. He said, إِنَّمَا كَانَ يَكْفِيكَ أَن تَقُولَ هَكَذَا. He said, it was enough for you to merely do this. And then he sallallahu alaihi wasallam tapped his hands like this on the ground, wiped his face and his hands. I just made tayammum right now in front of you. That's it. That's all tayammum is. Very simple. Some scholars add a person should say Bismillah just because Bismillah is something you say before wudu and before ghusl. However, is it integral to a tayammum? Not necessarily. And that is that a person hits his hands once, not 3 times, just once. They wipe their face like this, and then their hands. That's it. That's all tayammum is. That is how the Prophet ﷺ made tayammum. So we will end with that. On Sunday nights, usually our khatir is about 10-15 minutes. Sundays we take an extra 15 minutes for questions. We'll let that serenade and sink in. If anybody has any questions next week, and inshallah next week we'll talk about wiping over the footwear. God help us, inshallah, because it's going to be a thing. Allahu a'lam wa sallallahu wa sallam ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in walhamdulillahi rabbil alamin.